Ok.
Ya estamos en vivo, doctores.
Bueno, pues buenos días a todas y todos los que nos siguen en esta grabación o en vivo por YouTube, por el canal de YouTube de la División de Ciencias Sociales y Humanidades. Quisiera darles la bienvenida a todas y todos por acompañarnos en esta mañana, en esta conferencia titulada Acerca del Estado y de la Soberanía, una perspectiva asiática, On State and Sovereignty and Asian Perspective. Y tenemos el gran gusto, el honor de tener a la profesora Shael Mayaram del Centro de Estudio para las sociedades en Desarrollo en Delhi, en India. Y me gustaría pues agradecerle a Laura Carballido y también al Centro de Estudios de Asia y África del Colegio de México por esta colaboración que nos permite tener esta mañana a la profesora Mayaram con su conferencia. Professor Mayaram, thank you so much for being with us today. It's a big honor for the Department of Social Science to receive you, at least virtually. Hopefully next time we can get you in person. But thank you so much for the honor of presenting your conference. We've been really looking forward to this, and I really appreciate the effort of Laura Carballido, which is a professor of the Social Science Department at the Autonomous Metropolitan University in Coajimalpa, in Mexico City, and also the collaboration with the Center for Studies in Asia and Africa of El Colegio de Mexico, which have been working together to have you here with us today. So thank you so much, and I'll give the word to Laura Carballido for a brief introduction and then your conference. Thank you.
Pues muy buenos días a todas, a todos. Efectivamente es realmente un gusto tener a Shael Mayaram con nosotros. Ella pertenece al Centro para el Estudio de Sociedades en Desarrollo, como comentaba Rafael Calderón, quien es jefe de departamento. Ha sido también profesora y ha codirigido el Centro Internacional de Estudios Avanzados. Tiene una obra muy, muy vasta. No pretendo leer todos los títulos, pero me gustaría mencionar al menos Against History, Against the State, de 2003, Resisting Regimes. Tienen en coautoría Creating a Nationality de 1995 y tiene también múltiples libros editados. Los temas que ha trabajado son los pasados subalternos, temas sobre campesinos, pastores, comunidades que habitan los bosques, también ideas sobre cosmopolitanismo y ciudad. Tiene interés por el conocimiento de las tradiciones índicas e islámicas y pues bueno, en este momento está trabajando en torno al Islam no político, la herejía, martirio y la ciudad sagrada. So without further ado, thank you very much for sharing this time with us and welcome. Great to have you here. Gracias.
Well, wonderful. It's really wonderful. In the interest of time, I will start right away and share my screen. So just give me a minute to do that. No. Yeah, so here we are. Now I have to, yes, good. Okay, so Laura's already mentioned my talk on state and sovereignty. And the question I'm really going to address is how the understanding of Asian state forms has really changed our understanding of state and sovereignty. And hopefully next time when I visit you in person, I'll be able to deliver this talk in Spanish, not as good as yours, but, some kind of halting Spanish. So let's look at the kind of landscape of theories of state and sovereignty, which have been developed in the Asian context. And I'll first talk about the pre-modern context, and I'll then move on to the modern state and talk about discussions of state and sovereignty in that context. So, so first of all, in contrast to the European idea of monolithic, coercive, monopolistic sovereignty, you had the development of ideas of ritual sovereignty. And there's been a very rich and interesting discussion. The idea of the theater state, which was articulated by Clifford Geertz, and it has this wonderful discussion of Balinese kingship, where he describes the performative, and the performative in terms of court ritual, and how kingship is defined through ritual. Then there's the idea of galactic sovereignty, which is fairly influential, and this was articulated by Stanley Tambaya, and he talked about courts in South Asia, and used the metaphor of the mandala. This is a kind of a motif from Tibetan Buddhism, and where you have a center, but there are other centers which are not necessarily dominated by the center, right? So he spoke about the center as the sun, but obviously galactic sovereignty had to do with
Perdimos a la profesora, ¿verdad?
Creo que sí.
Se dejó de escuchar.
Y vamos a esperar unos minutos y
Sí.
tenemos un problema de su red.
Voy a quitar mi video, de hecho, por si eso disminuye el consumo de datos. Tenemos unos momentos, espero que se resuelva la conexión. You have the microphone off, the audio off.
Yeah. Okay. Now, is it good? Yeah. Okay.
Yes. Yes.
So, okay. So there's been this discussion also about the importance of the political versus the social. And there are particularly two historians, Hokart and Nicholas Dirks, who argued for the importance and the centrality of the political and the ways in which the political and kingship can actually alter the social. Social hierarchies can be altered. And there was some very interesting discussion, particularly by Nicholas Dirks in his book, The Hollow Crown. Now, Suzanne Rudolph, who gave the presidential address to the Asian Studies Association, she pointed out that the absolute state of Europe, therefore, cannot be our model. And we need to really think about very different models when it comes to, say, the Mughal Empire or the Han, the Han, or the Ming, the Ming in China. What I think has been very influential work is James Scott's work, where he talks about the hill polities, and he speaks about the shadow empires of nomadic pastoralists. And he develops this argument in relation to his work on China and Southeast Asia. I'll come back to that a bit. And I myself, in my contribution, have argued about about the idea of stateness, right, as a quality which changes in time and space. And in my book, one of the things I discuss is the idea of the Pal polity as a kind of anti-monarchical state formation, as an alternative to kingship, to monarchy. Okay, so let's look at conceptions of sovereignty. So there's the idea of shared and negotiated sovereignty, which is ritual sovereignty typically, or the segmentary state was about that, shared and negotiated sovereignty. But there are also alternative conceptions of sovereignty, which you find among subaltern peoples, where the sovereignty of the state is contested. And Jim Scott, in his wonderful book on not being governed, which is an anarchist history of upland Southeast Asia, refers to the ungoverned as Zomia. And this is the Zomia is the name he gives to this shatter zone. So Zomia is the zone of refuge and has been the zone of refuge for something like 1.5 millennia. And it's currently inhabited by something like 1.5 million people. And there's a great diversity of ethnicity and language among these people. And he talks about how all the lands, the hill peoples, which are in high altitudes, and this ranges from the central highlands of Vietnam to northeastern India, and then through the 5 Southeast Asian nations. There's Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, Thailand, and Burma, and then the 4 provinces of China, including Sichuan. Now, so he's talking really about something like 2.5 million square kilometers and 100 million minority peoples, which is in the Southeast Asian mainland massive. So this is this huge area at the periphery of 9 states and at the center of none. And one of the arguments that has come up in the discussion on sovereignty in Asia is that pastoralism has actually been a preferred option to sedentarism. And Latimer's pointed this out with respect to his discussion on pre-modern China, and David Ludden's also pointed out that mobility and was actually the dominant mode till really the 19th century among peoples. Okay, so I'll speak a bit about some of my own work, and which is on a community called the Mewatis. And this is a community which fought for their autonomy against various state forms for 8 centuries. And I've argued that it's really an extremely exceptional, unique, if you will, account of the resistance to the state. And this is a community which is, this is from a late 19th century slide of the community. And you can say, you know, in the illustrations that, you know, they're Mewatis, Muslims who were originally Hindus. But in fact, this community was both Hindu and Muslim. And I've argued that they actually represent a different idea of religion than the dominant European idea of religion. Okay, so now, so in terms of the Pal polity, sovereignty is pluralized in the Pal. The Pal is a kind of a clan. It's related to the idea of the clan, derives from kinship, and this anti-monarchical and non-monarchical, non-state form, very similar to how the Afghans actually governed themselves before the advent of monarchy in Afghanistan. And they faced an onslaught of state forms. There was a Turkish Sultanate, which arrives in the late 12th century, the Mughal Empire, and they also fought against the British Empire. So all of them were trying to conquer and domesticate and sedentarize the community of Mewatis. So their resistance is very similar to the kinds of evasion that was practiced against a Han Chinese state that Scott describes, and the resultant then campaigns of the Han and Ming dynasties. Now, what's interesting is that this is not a zone of wet rice cultivation. You know, this millet is the dominant crop. And they're also not only peasants, but also pastoralists of the cow. And the resistance is documented both by written histories in Persian and English, and also by their own oral tradition, their epics and performance, texts which are performed. And there's a kind of battle of categories, really, because the state, you know, constructs them and through time. This is like from the 14th century right down to the 20th century. So the state constructs them first as a group which is, you know, responsible for disorder, for rebellion, for protest. What is the Arabic term is fasad. And there's a very interesting story, you know, in their oral tradition, where they talk about how the Mughal army is sent against them. And the army tries to forcibly collect revenue in a context of famine. And the army also prevents women from performing their rituals. So it's intervening in a more cultural sense. So it's not just the kind of the idea that, you know, so the revenue is not to be claimed by the community. The revenue is to be claimed by the imperial state. And and this is something I tried to discuss and outline in my book, is that, you know, they contest state categories with their own. So the first category that is articulated in their language in this particular story is the idea of jung, that we are at war, and therefore we can refuse to pay the state revenue. And I'm sorry, there's a misspelling here. The second is julam. Julam comes from, again, the Persian word zulm, which is injustice, right? So the narrative, the epic holds the state and the army responsible for julam, for injustice, you know, and associated violence, and also highlights the fact of jama, that, you know, jama is claimed by the state as revenue, So these are the categories actually that are articulated through this particular story, which describes a battle in the 17th century. And it's very interesting to see that there are the accounts of these battles also in the Mughal records, in imperial records. So it's not only a community description, it's also, there's a parallel account by the state, by the imperial state. A lot of this takes place in the mountains, the hill peoples. Okay, so, and I've quoted him here, the mountains being a refuge for state fleeing people, including guerrillas, is an important geographical theme. I developed the idea of the friction of terrain, which is a new way of understanding political space and the difficulties of state making in pre-modern societies. So this is from his The Art of Not Being Governed, an anarchist account. And this is actually a visual from, which is in my new book. And the new book is titled, it's a book on nationalism, on right-wing nationalism, hyper-nationalism, if you will. And it's called The Secret Life of Another Indian Nationalism, Transitions from the Pax Britannica to the Pax Americana. And so the Pax Britannica, which is supposedly, the idea that the British brought peace, to this entire, huge part of the world through the empire, is actually, clearly a fiction. There's been so much good work on colonialism. And in this lithograph from, which is from something like the 1820s, and it describes how the mountains of the central Aravallis, this is something that we're talking about, Western Rajasthan, which is a state in India. And this area is, clearly a landscape of conquest. So here there's a completely different community. I was talking about the Mewatis in my other work, and this is the community called the Mer. And this is another visual from an administrative account, really, another lithograph, where you have the chiefs and the musicians, and they're conquered. So I won't go into that, into this book, but this is a book about hyper-nationalism. And it's, again, and here you see a much more contemporary figure from a social movement, the man who's moving in his little hut. His name is Chunni Singh Merat, and he works with the Mazdoor Kisan Shakti Sangathan, which would be translated as the peasant organization of peasant and labor power. So this is an extremely important organization. So, and you can see that, through a social movement, and this particular group actually initiated some very important legislation on the right to information. And the right to information law, it was passed by Parliament, actually became, an example of its kind throughout the world of the right to information as a law. Of course, it's been compromised in practice, but that's another matter. Okay, so that's another, and some of my work has been on pastoralists, and this is, and I've made the argument that actually there are 4 different kinds of economies, political economies and cultural economies in India. One is you have the industrial economy. Then you have the agricultural economy, and you have the artisanal economy, and finally you have the cultural economy of mobile peoples, including pastoralists or tribal peoples, if you will. And this has been the most neglected terrain when it comes to state action and sovereignty by the post-colonial state. So let me take you on now to we're already in the modern context, and but I want to introduce you to something which happened in India, a movement that has become known as the farmers' movement, and which is actually a battle for land and for life forms. Now, this began in late 2020, and the protests were carried out over a long period of time, and it's only finally, and the protests were against these three what they call black laws. And what farmers were really protesting, and there were all kinds of farmers. There were the rich farmers, there were the poor farmers, landless labor, people of all castes, all different religions involved. So it was amazing to see how they came together. And the protest was against the corporatization of agriculture, that it will be possible for these huge companies to come in to the countryside and actually build these huge go downs to store grain. And so it was against this marketplace law, because in India you have peasants are able to take their produce to the mandis, to markets, to sell them. And the state also provides a kind of minimum support price, as in the case of wheat. Now, all that was threatened by these laws. Come along with the whole crisis of agriculture, where you have, the fragmentation of land holdings. So if say a farmer has 1 acre of land, then it's all divided between say all his sons. So the sons get really a much smaller land holding. So there's been this whole process of the fragmentation of land holdings. And of course, there's climate change and global warming and so on. Now, what was very interesting in terms of what I want to argue is the way in which the farmers reclaimed sovereignty and formulated an alternative sovereignty. And this was about collective decision-making. The entire Kisan organization, many organizations were involved in the movement, and they had a collective body which took the decisions collectively after discussion and deliberation. There was communication through a YouTube channel, as also on Facebook and various social media. And what was important was the emphasis on non-violence, even though there was one instance of violence which broke out when one group tried to enter Delhi, and it was really about inclusion. It was about inclusion. And what was interesting was also the kind of cultural aspect. So you had all these poets and performers, and I wish I could show you a video clip. I wasn't able to put it on the PowerPoint. But here are some slides. You can see that there's a farmer sitting here, and the sign says, take back the black laws. And this is the way in which, so basically, farmers at various places set up these entire new cities, tented cities, and there was provision for food, And the Sikhs, the people of the Sikh religion, have this idea in their tradition of the langar, that is free food for everybody, and this goes back to the medieval idea of the Sikh congregation, and which is an articulation of civil society, which is articulated some way back in the 17th century. And this was actually a major turning point, where you had a whole critique of the rule of kings and priests, and so on. So this was a major movement for equality. Here again, what the farmers' movement has done is, and this is the pandemic's at its height. And the state in India was, arguing that this is a danger to health and public safety, security, and so on. But the pandemic, the cold wave, the dust storms did not bother the farmers. And here you can see what they've done is, on the highway, they've opened the toll gates and said that all passage of all vehicles, all vehicles should be allowed free passage. So, and that's one of my friends who's a political leader, and I'm sitting next to her. So, I'll stop here, and then we can, let's go on to. Questions and any comments, clarifications that I can make, I'll be happy to do that.
Well, I don't know if any of my colleagues or students would like to pose a question, or perhaps I can take the privilege, since I have already my microphone on. I would like to ask a couple of questions, but more in going back to the first part, I think, to talk rather than on these recent protests. I think what I find, one of the things that I find really interesting about your work, and that you also share with James Scott, for example, is the idea of going back again to look at the place of mobile communities in global history. And particularly, of course, for South Asian history, you have talked about pastoralists as being just one kind of activity that these mobile communities have. But I really find that very interesting. So I don't know if you, precisely because I'm thinking about in terms, of African history, Latin American history, Asian history in general. You've talked about that. And the other is that I don't know if you could elaborate on this idea of the categories used by the state, and that we as historians, anthropologists, need to rethink. You said just briefly tribal communities, just in one point of your talk, and I guess it's because precisely, you've written about the need to rethink, these categories that we have inherited from colonial period, and that we just happily have carried on, using for the independent period. So I don't know if you could address those two things.
Yeah, Laura, that's a very important set of questions. And one is, the first response I'll have is that one needs to make a distinction between pastoralism and mobilities, and mobilities have been of a phenomenal number. For instance, and so in some of my work on cosmopolitanism, I've argued that you really had one of the reasons why there was a cosmopolitanism in Asian cities was because of these various kinds of mobilities. So, for instance, you had Sheldon Pollock, he's a scholar of Sanskrit, and he's referred to the Sanskrit cosmopolis. So here you had actually Brahmins whose terrain was something like, they were mobile from Afghanistan right up to Indonesia, and had, of course, a huge impact then on the Balinese kingship, Cambodian kingship. Kingship is brought, introduced, and the Ramayana as an epic form. The Sanskrit text is introduced, and is very and becomes a big model for kingship in, say, Thailand, but also in Southeast Asia. So that's just one kind of. You also have other kinds of monks. Buddhist monks are hugely mobile, and we need to remember that before the coming of Islam, actually, it was Buddhism which was dominant in the subcontinent. And before it really moves out of the subcontinent and then moves to, Tibet and then China, and then also Southeast Asia. So the Buddhist monks were tremendously mobile, and so were then in the medieval period Sufis. Sufi mystics. And then you have all kinds of classes and all kinds of castes. For instance, you have the blacksmith, and the blacksmith actually moves around in a caravan, and they go from place to place, and they sell things like vessels for cooking and tools for farming, and they're hugely important. So you have genealogists and performers and poets. So really, Asia is really on the move. Pre-modern Asia is hugely on the move, even though there's sedentarization is a parallel phenomenon. Now, pastoralists, are one kind of mobility then, and forest communities, the hunter-gatherers are another kind of, people who, slash and burn, right? You have this, I think in Africa, at least, Latin America probably also has, right? So slash and burn, and they move on. So you have pastoralists, and then you have what the visual I showed of, with those three baby goats is seasonal pastoralism. So in the desert, for instance, pastoralism is an extremely important. It's a mode of survival, because in what's so whenever the dry season comes, people will migrate with their flock of, it could be camels, it could be sheep, very often goats, and so on. But especially sheep and goats, will migrate, and then when the rains come, they will come back, right? So pastoralism, but unfortunately, pastoralism has been really, really neglected, and by the modern state, and and it was such an important form of livelihood and way of being, including in the Himalayan region, where you have a large number of the communities like the Bhotias, who trade wool and salt. The trade with Tibet was carried on by the Bhotias, and in Kashmir you have the Gujjar Bakarwal, which are again very important pastoralist communities. So the state has actually pressured communities to sedentarize, and not really realize the value of, pastoralism as a vibrant life form. And I did a small piece on a community called the Gujars, and the Gujars, were protesting, and they wanted, because we have a big affirmative action program, where quotas, there are quotas like you have for indigenous peoples, right? Here in Latin America, you have quotas in the Indian context for people from the lower castes and also from the tribes. So what the Gujars wanted was that they should be declared a scheduled tribe. Now there was a huge agitation, and it's really sad how statist categories have come to, condition people's ways of thinking. Okay, so the Gujar argument was that we are a primitive people, right? So anthropology has fought against the category primitive, right? And here is a community saying, no, we are a primitive people and we practice witchcraft. We practice witchcraft and shamanism, and therefore we should be a scheduled tribe, which is a typical example of how colonial anthropology has, really dominated the self, and also conditioned communities. So the question of category, and as you rightly mentioned, the tribe is a completely modern category. It's a statist category, and so the big debate is, people say that the tribes are indigenous peoples, but actually in India, and the new work on DNA is showing that everybody in the subcontinent is a migrant, really have arrived from some kind of stream of migration. So there's no really, no peoples whom you could really call indigenous. So, so of course, there is the whole, there is the importance of forest communities, at least those who had forests. I showed you that visual of the Mer, in the early 19th century, and this is before the entire area of their forests got cut down, because they were seen as disobedient and refractory and protesting, and so the colonial state comes in and cuts down this huge tract of forest. Yeah, and this had been done, of course, in the 13th century with respect to the Meos, but here's the modern state, the colonial state, doing this, and then they're sedentarized, and it's which is terribly tragic, because this is what introduces huge famines. In the famine of 1899, something like 1/4 of the animal population dies, and 1/6 of the human population, So it's calamitous. Yeah, there's something in the chat box.
Yes.
Okay, so with regard to Europe, I think the EU was a very interesting model of how sovereignty could be reorganized so that borders and boundaries become less significant. So I think that was a very important moment. But unfortunately, with Brexit, and there's a whole right wing, which has come to the fore, which is held the EU responsible for the fact that they've lost their jobs and so on and so forth. So there's been also a lot of resistance to that. But I think as in terms of rethinking sovereignty, the idea of the European Union it's a very important idea, a very important vision, even though it's not been realized to its fullest extent. And of course, now it's terrible that we're in a situation of war. Yeah. And
yeah. Oh. Yes, please.
Yes. Can you hear me?
yes.
Yes. Okay. Thank you for the presentation. Could you please tell us more about this different idea of religion that you were talking about earlier when you were speaking about the Mewatis?
Yes.
Thank you.
Well, one thing I'll recommend that you also read my new book. So where I discuss, there's a chapter we discuss, which is titled "Another History of Religion." So, there's this big question of whether religion is a universal. And this has been an argument, and there's been writing that, criticism of this idea. And it's been said that, for instance, in other cultures, you did not have the kind of the idea of belief, and that you had, for instance, in the Abrahamic religions, right? And in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, belief is very central. Whereas what you have in the non-Abrahamic religions are perhaps, practices, rituals, and so on and so forth. So one of my colleagues, Milind Wakankar, who has discussed the idea of religion, and clearly, the modern idea of religion, religion with a capital R, is one of the things that has caused the greatest damage to the world. And this is the idea of which came in with the Reconquista, 1492. And after the Reconquista, what was this whole idea of, one kingdom, one religion? The idea that each prince must have, a religion, and each kingdom must have a single religion. And you had the expulsion of the Moors, the Moriscos, and the Jews, right? From the Catholic, kingdom of Spain after that. And the violence in its wake, the decimation of the Amerindians, you could tell me about that, really, because, you probably, read and experienced, those histories far more. What happened to in Latin America as a result of the Spanish and the Portuguese conquest. So, and the modern idea of religion. So let me go back. Yeah, Milind Wakankar talks about the prehistory of religion. Yeah, so that there's a different history, and before the modern idea of religion, there is a prehistory of religion, such as you could find in the Indian subcontinent. Now, I've questioned that, and I've argued that why call it a prehistory, and that this is another history of religion. And religion, where I would emphasize religiosities, lived religions, and so on, and so forth. And what's important is that in this other history of religion, it was not an either or model of belonging. It did not mean that you were either Christian, or you were Jewish, or you were Muslim, or you were Hindu exclusively. It meant that you could be, Hindu and Muslim, as in the case of the Mewatis, as in the case of the Mer. They were also, Hindu and Muslim until, of course, all the missionaries of various kinds, the Christian missionaries, and then the new Hindu missionaries, come and tell them, no, you are, you should be converted, and then you should be reconverted, and so on and so forth. So this is all based on the idea of singular belonging, that you must belong only to one religion. So, so this is an either or model. And there's another model of belonging, which is a both and, that you can belong to more than one religion. So there's multiple belonging. You have the phenomenon of bi-religiosity or multi-religiosity. And this has actually been the dominant form in most Asian cultures, where you are in Japan, you are Buddhist and Shinto. Similarly in China, you have the three religions, and there's a lot of sharing between them. In terms of people's practice, even though they theologically they define themselves as distinct. Confucianism has its own texts, Buddhism has its own texts, but at the popular level, there's been a lot of back and forth and borrowing, So the anthropologist Val Daniel, calls this the toolbox approach, which is that I go to whatever God whom I think works best for, whatever, disease. So if it's, say, I have smallpox, then I go to the goddess of smallpox, she might work better, even though I'm a Muslim, right? So, so the idea of toolbox, yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Shell. I know you have a busy schedule in this trip, so I really want to thank you for having this opportunity. For your lecture, for interacting with you. Because of the questions, you might have seen that students, colleagues here at the university, we have interest in sociology of religion, inquiry committees and commissions, and also studies of the state. So we really thank you for this opportunity. I also would like to thank again to the Centro de Estudios de Asia y África del Colegio de México, particularly to Ishita Banerjee, whose effort to get us together, put us in touch, has been really great. And well, thanks again. Hopefully the next time will not be in Zoom, but in a seminar room, and we'll have more time to talk to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Laura. Thanks a lot, everybody. I really, really enjoyed this, and hopefully there will be, another visit, as Laura said. So till then,
yes.
Bye.
Muchas gracias. Hasta luego. Gracias a todos por acompañarnos.
Gracias.
Bien, bueno, gracias.